the Magnificat. And each Renaissance composer, no matter what country, probably wrote 7 or 8 different settings. So as time goes on, we get to the 1600s and 1700s. The Magnificat becomes even more of a concerted piece. In other words, each verse set separately. It involves chorus and orchestra, and it really becomes the centerpiece of Vespers, both in Germany, Italy, every country. So now composers are using the orchestra and setting each verse apart. So we're going to hear the first movement of the greatest of these settings, which is, of course, by Bach. He wrote it for Christmas in Leipzig, I think the very first year that he took that job. So
let me ask you, would this be a time, Natalie, what are you planning on setting up? What were you going to have them?
I have some images of the...
Okay, for the sake of the kids, I'd like, and so they can get going with their activity, if we could take a break from the historical music and just have Natalie share her material for the kids, and then we'll go back to the other. Very good.
All right, Rose. All right. So we were setting the scene. Where are we? Who's there? And so on our first slide there, you'll see, my apologies, I don't actually have I couldn't find image rights, so there's a watermark on that first image of Mary and Elizabeth together, which tag will pull up in just a second.
Want the next one?
Yes, the next slide, please.
All right.
Okay, here we are, Mary and Elizabeth, cousins, both pregnant, visiting with one another, and sharing the good news with each other. I won't today lead you in any kind of Visio Divina, godly looking sort of, but we could try that in future sessions.
Could you just say, you just said a phrase, Visio Divina. Why don't you translate that?
So Visio Divina is Divina, divine, Visio, vision, divine looking, basically looking for the divine in art. And there's a way that there's a process of Visio Divina that involves prayer and looking at something with a mind or a reflection on how God is speaking through what you're seeing. I picked this piece of art because it's one of my favorites of Mary and Elizabeth meeting one another. And what I really want to point out, because it really strikes me, is if you look right here, in this part of the image, you see these swirls. And these swirls almost seem to be interconnected. And to me, this always represented John and Jesus and the way in which, in their mother's wombs, they're speaking to one another and connected to one another.
Oh, wow. That is cool.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
So that's the first piece of art. So in this one, and you can see it on Mary's face, and both in Mary and Elizabeth's face, there's a lot of joy. I know joy is our word of the day in this particular day of Advent, even though liturgically we would talk about Mary in the Magnificat, the fourth Sunday of Advent. This goes well with today. So could we move to the next image?
I'll try. There we go.
This is another piece of art I wanted to show to you. This is Mary's Song by Lauren Wright Pittman. And You can find it on Sanctified Art if you'd like to look for this image and purchase prints of it or anything like that. This is Mary, and again, you can see the joy she's filled with. When she speaks the Magnificat, which is Magnificat, what does that word mean? Does anybody here have you ever heard of a word with the word mag in it? Magnificent? Magnify?
Ooh.
So I brought a magnifying glass, if any of you younger ones are here. Magnificat comes from the first words of Mary's song, "My soul magnifies the Lord." So what do we use a magnifying glass for? What's that? To enlarge. To make greater. So in Latin, magn, M-A-G-N, the root means great. So any word you have with that M-A-G-N in it, magnify, magnificent, those words, I've just blanked on other words. Magna Carta, Charlemagne, all of those words actually have that magna root, that great root in it. So my soul magnifies the Lord. What do we do with a magnifying glass? Is we hold it up to something that we want to see in more detail. And it shows it enlarged so that we can focus on it and see it more clearly. Oftentimes we magnify things that are small, but we can also magnify pieces of something really big to understand it more closely, more detailed, better. And I think that's a big part of what's happening with Mary. Her soul magnifies God, God which is massive and great, brings into focus and detail a piece of God. And there's so much joy in that. So I wanted to sing today, this morning, Tell Out My Soul, which is a setting of Mary's song. And it has a lot of that big joy in it. Tell out my soul, the song goes. It's written into the musical notation. Tell out my soul. And I was hoping we could stand up and use our bodies and be big when we sing through that. Jim, would you mind playing that for us? It's in our hymnal. It was 478. So grab your hymnal. We've got one nearby. And let me just pull up that number again. I should have had that one memorized.
I found it.
You found it?
438.
438. See? I knew I was a little off. 438. And so we have the words on the next few slides for those of you, if anyone's at home still watching, and for those of you here, if you don't want to use your hymnal.
Ready?
All right.
Tell
I will turn you over to Jim and Ted.
I will have a new appreciation for this song as a way to be with Mary in the Magnificat. Thank you. All right, I'm going to switch over the source two so that we can get back to Peter. This is back to you and Jim's sound clips.
So we were saying a little bit about the big musical settings of the Magnificat, and in the Baroque period, the 18th century, the most famous of these that we still have, and there are many of them, is Bach. And it's written in 12 movements. He wrote it for Christmas, I think, in 1723 or 1724. But interestingly, you would expect Bach, a Protestant Lutheran, that the text would be in German. This is not the case because Latin is preserved by Luther as a liturgical language, especially in big city churches. So Bach wrote this piece for his gig in Leipzig. We're talking about a time in musical composition where rhetoric is everything, and Bach is the master of it. So you'll hear this. Okay. so you'll hear this. We'll hear first the very opening movement of the piece that only sets the words Magnificat anima mea, my soul magnifies the Lord. Big orchestra because for festive occasions Bach uses trumpet, timpani, a pair of oboes, a pair of flutes. So we're going to hear the first movement of that, Peter, which is excerpt number 2. It's really the world's danciest music. Shadow over all of that glorious D major light. So, what can you look for as musical symbolism in this, or musical rhetoric? The prolonged treatment given to the word Magnificat, my soul magnifies. Also, the key believe it or not, for musicians, D major, which is the key that this is written in, is the most festive of keys, though he originally wrote it in E flat and then changed it to D. The sort of danciness, concerto kind of feeling of the music. Each one of the 12 following movements has those same kind of rhetorical gestures, some of them even more specific. And we're going to hear one example of that. We're going to hear the setting of, as he promised to Abraham and to our forefathers. Again, here the rhetorical setting is that he chooses, that Bach chooses for this movement, as many Baroque composers did, a kind of antiquated and very formal form. I'm sorry to be pleonastic about it, but a formal form, which is the fugue. He reduces the number of voices from 5 at the beginning to 4. So it becomes it becomes a symbol of the law and the Hebrew scriptures and the Old Covenant. So Peter, then after that, you'll hear the world's most spectacular Gloria Patri, glory be to the Father and to the Son, where you hear angels kind of going up and down. And then another great rhetorical gesture, when he gets to the words, as it was in the beginning, well, you figure it out. There's a kind of a little musical pun going on here. So Peter, if we could hear the next excerpt, this is the fugue as he promised to Abraham and to our forefathers. don't see the kind of musical play on words there at the end when he gets to the words as it was in the beginning? In the interest of brevity, I'll just tell you. When he sets the words as it was in the beginning, he takes back the exact same music as the beginning of the piece. And I mean, of course, it adapts it according to the exigencies of the words. But it's a trick that a lot of Baroque composers did. And one really good thing about it is that having those words there, at the occasion for a little musical pun, it also helps the composer to frame the piece so that it unifies the beginning and the end of the piece. And in the middle of many of these big Magnificat settings, especially Bach, there's kind of an arch form. That goes on, that type of composition for the Magnificat at Vespers goes on through the 19th century. But I just really briefly, if we have the time, I'd like to talk about what happens to the Magnificat in the Anglican tradition. So, unlike Luther, Cranmer doesn't admit of the use of Latin anymore. And the restrictions put on composers are pretty tight. You're not allowed to make long musical elaborations of a phrase or make big runs on a note or repeat a lot of notes. So you'd think that composers would go crazy under that kind of restriction. But because in England during the Elizabethan period, there were just a bunch of genius composers running around. Within 50 years of Cranmer's translation, in the Book of Common Prayer, we have wonderful musical compositions on English words for the first time. And for me, the greatest of all these composers is Gibbons, whose short service we're going to sing tonight. But I wanted to play just a really quick excerpt from another Gibbons service that we've also sung here that shows you some of these new techniques. Here, this service uses both soloists and chorus kind of responding to each other. So we can listen to just a little bit of the beginning of Gibbons' Magnificat from the second service. This is a technique that was new at Gibbons' time of alternating soloists and choir. If you're very interested in it, the technique is called verse, so that it's an alternation of soloists and choir. The last piece that I'd like to play for you, and it's, I think if you're patient enough, I think we should listen to the whole thing. It's one of the greatest compositions in the Anglican tradition, which is a 1944 piece by Herbert Howells that it's called the King's College Magnificat Nunc Dimittis. Howells wrote probably 10 or 12 settings of the evening canticles for the Anglican Church. And each one, interestingly, he designed according to the acoustic of the building for which it was commissioned. So this one is, it's really got a sort of Second World War feel to it. And it's designed for that beautiful building that's King's College Chapel in England. So Peter, the last excerpt, and then I'm off to lunch.
My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit doth rejoice in God my Saviour. For he hath regarded the lowliness of
Did you know?
Oh,
I don't know what that was.
so you've got this sort of, a few years ago we did an evensong that where we sang this, and it was all music from around the time of the Second World War. And I really feel like at the beginning of this piece, the kind of joy of the Magnificat is tempered by the suffering of the Second World War. I find it very beautiful. Also to note that from the 19th century on, the organ becomes a much more important component and replaces an orchestra in Anglican service music.
I have this thing. I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
And then you can have lunch.
Okay.
Which I also want. Well, thank you very much, Jim. You know, the choir speaks about what a treat it is to sing with Jim and for Jim. And in part, it's because of this kind of wealth of knowledge and appreciation for what's going on, what the composer had in mind in the original composition and the evolution of compositions over time. So Jim, looking at how Anglican music has evolved, would you say that it is still shaped by that some of those initial strictures that Cranmer put on it? So it said the constraints, the strictures that Cranmer put on Anglican music. In other words, it sounded to me like you were saying that some of the ornates, some of the flourishes, as well as the lack of Latin, impacted heavily the composers in those first 50 years. Do you think that has had long effect?
I mean, I think there are certain traits, like if you go all the way back to the Gibbons, I think that very often for the Anglican liturgy, often composers write a more concise setting of the text, and I think it's still evident in Howells. I mean, it's also that, you know, there are time constraints, as Ted often tells me, that there are time constraints because, like, if you're setting the evening canticles, you know, you're kind of, I mean, you're looking up against a maximum of 15 minutes. I know that, but I think also that you're right, that one thing that Cranmer was sort of looking for was the primacy of the text and music that would be reflective of the text, but not necessarily get in its way. The Roman Catholics went through the same thing at the Council of Trent, the bishops wanted a much bigger simplification of the music, as is the want of the clergy.
Well, it's interesting because to think about that in terms of, or in regards to the hope that somehow we are lifted closer to God in the liturgy, you know, and what actually helps us do that? There's something, I think, in letting go of regular time.
Right.
Right, which can happen, I think, as we allow ourselves just to descend or be uplifted into music that takes us around, you know, takes us to places we didn't expect, takes us back over the same text in new ways, and so forth. That's harder in today's church life.
I think so. I mean, I think today it's really, you know, I mean, I'm sorry to sound like an old geezer cynic, but, you know, people are very concerned for conciseness, which is, I mean, conciseness is a great thing. But going all the way back to Gregorian chant, which is sort of where we started the whole discussion about this canticle, one beauty of Gregorian chant is that it's not measured. It flows freely according to the words, or it's supposed to. So yes, I think sometimes taking ourselves outside of a kind of metrical context where where the music flows more in tune with the words, and lets the words kind of dominate the. That's the perfect vocal music and it's. To me, it's perfect church music that that it does allow you kind of to pass into a different state.
You said something funny the other day when we were talking about all of this, about how at one point they misinterpreted the metrical setting and tried to get all the words in on one.
Right.
Can you say that?
What's it again?
You were talking about how at one stage of translating psalms or something into metrical settings, they would rush and try to fit all the words into one metrical rhythm.
Right. Like the metrical setting of the Magnificat that we sang with Natalie, they're basically the words of the Magnificat turned into metered poetry. And the good thing about that is it gives access to the text to a big group of people. Because for us, it's easier to sing the metrical thing than it is for us to chant.
And my last question is this. I heard you say that you thought that this was the most magnificent Anglican Magnificat. Do you have a favorite in all of the repertoire, beyond Anglicanism?
Well, and it's a repertoire actually that's being resuscitated in British cathedrals, like where now they don't mind if you sing in Latin, like that Palestrina Magnificat that we heard as the first excerpt. That I love that repertoire, and it's being done more and more for evensong in Anglican settings. And of course, nobody could not like the Bach Magnificat. It's just, to me, it's like one of the greatest musical compositions ever. Those are my favorites.
So it's like having children. You can't just pick one favorite.
Right, no.
They're like your babies. Yes.
There might be a favorite one by each composer.
Wonderful. Well, Jim, thank you. Natalie, where are you? Natalie, thank you so much. I love the art that you brought to us, and thank you for bringing something that would be engaging for children as well. And I thank you for doing this. I know we had a few people here today only, but where a few are gathered, right? And so thank you. I know that something about approaching Advent through music, which just gives me kind of a quiet joy. So I thank you for that. Thank you both. Next week, no program, but we'll be drinking coffee and eating with Greg.
Yeah, there's an extra in the back. I'm going to take these.